大家好。
Well, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Climate Finance in China session.
Debate Climate Finance in China. Caixin is China's leading finance and business media, and our topic today is climate finance in China. As the world's second largest economy and the largest emitter of greenhouse gases, China's effort, needless to say, is crucial to the world's effort combating climate change. But when we talk about climate finance, it's about the scale, the gap, the opportunity, and the urgency. To achieve China's 30-60 goal, which is carbon peaking before 2030 and carbon neutrality before 2060, it might require an estimated more than $15 trillion in investment over the next 30 years. Meanwhile, China has the world's largest green bond market, accounting for a quarter of the world's total. And US and China, despite a lot of disputes on many issues, co-chaired the G20 Sustainable Finance Working Group and issued G20 Transition Finance Framework last year in Bali. So we're looking at a very mixed picture, and we're standing at a very crucial juncture where the magnitude of the challenge is still vastly outweighed by the financial resources currently allocated to this problem. But the hope and collective drive is equally formidable, and we have 4 panelists to share with us what can we do and how should we do it. Our panelists today to discuss this issue will include, let me quickly introduce, starting from the lady on my left side, Naoko Ishii, Director of Center for Global Commons at the University of Tokyo. And she's the former CEO of Global Environmental Facility and former Deputy Vice Minister of Finance of Japan. And in the middle is Mr. Deng Jianling, Director of the Board and President of China Huainan Group, one of the 5 largest state-owned electricity generation companies in China. And Andrew Abrol, the lady in the middle, is the CEO and head of wholesale banking, Asia Pacific, at ING Bank. And last but not least is Fred Hu, the founder and chairman of Primavera Capital, a leading PE fund, and Fred is also a very well-known economist. So I'll start with Fred. Tell us, what's the status quo of global and China market for green finance or climate finance, and what are the key challenges you see?
Yes, thank you, Stan. As you mentioned, energy transition is a pressing task for the world, and climate financing is critically important to speed up the transition to emission-free, future for the world. China, as the biggest consumer of energy and the still biggest emitter of carbon, obviously has a vital role to play. I am very encouraged to see China has been super proactive, not just from government, but really in the corporate sector, like what the Mr. Deng, the company Mr. Deng represents, and in the private investment community, venture, private equity, and of course our financial institutions like banks. So altogether, have been very much focused on energy transition and how to mobilize capital to fund the transition. Just to give you one single number, okay, ICBC, some of heard ICBC? Certainly the biggest bank in China. I'm very proud, as a member of the board. ICBC has provided more than $560 billion in green finance and broadly defined. So everything from renewable energy, solar, wind, to EV, battery, smart grid, carbon mitigation or carbon capture, and so on and so forth. So $560 billion. Think about it. That's a massive number. Definitely ICBC obviously is the leading lender here in China, but also probably the largest lender worldwide. And ICBC is not alone. Other big Chinese banks, whether state-owned or private banks, also have been very active in green financing, credit provision for companies and startups to make like the transition possible. Other than formal banking system, I would say the capital markets and private investors, also have active role to play, because energy transition requires innovation in technology, new type of energy sources, require innovation in how to use the energy, like mobility, transportation is a big sector of the economy, but it's also accounting for 1/5 to 1/4 of all the carbon emission, depending on which country. In China, it's easily over 1/4 from the transportation sector. So EV, transition to electrical vehicle, is a big solution. Not the only solution, but it's a very big solution to solve the emission problem. So, and then battery, right? To have the more efficient, longer duration, high density, safer electrical battery to help society, mass adoption of EVs, right? Away from traditional combustion engine vehicles. So that all require innovation in technology, innovation in business model and practices. So private equity and venture used to think it's only for internet, mobile internet, for AI and digital technologies. Actually, innovation plays just as important role in energy transition. So to promote the innovation, you need more active, venture investor for early stage, startup, but also for growth equity, for more established, companies. So this is worldwide, roughly 120 billion go into energy transition related, climate related startups. It came down a little bit from last year because of the public market has been underperforming, but I think that's a temporary blip. In fact, venture financing and private equity continue, to really very, very focused on this whole space. There's a lot of exciting opportunities going on. If later I have time, I would be happy to share with you some of the examples.
Thank you. Thank you for giving us very concrete numbers and some of the examples on the private sector financing that can power that innovation. I want to come to Naoko. You have extensive experience on multinational institutes. And Fred gave us the example of the private sector, but it has to be coming both from the private and the public. And you're an expert on the blended finance, which is using public money to crowd in private money. So tell us more about blended finance and what kind of role that can play in climate financing.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me here. If we can take a little step back from blended finance to a global financial structure issue. Has any of you attended the Paris summit last week? The French President Macron called it the Global Financial Pact Summit. And then I was there, and it's really kind of so exciting to see that there is an emerging consensus coming from that the audience that very much joined by Global South, that the top leadership, a little bit of Global North, and there is a kind of consensus emerging that current financial system, current international financial architecture is not really fit for purpose for SDG or climate finance. And then we have seen a lot of that debt accumulating for the Global South, which is kind of perpetuating that poverty trap. And of course, it doesn't help any of those middle-income countries or low-income countries to achieve the climate goal either. So that we have to find a way to how to fix this international financial system. And one concrete way is, as you, the moderator just mentioned, how we can deploy the public finance much more smartly to mobilize the private sector, the finance. So that's a kind of definition of the blended finance. However, it's not just bringing the different source of the financing, that it has to bring the different capacity and the different knowledge, different the function of those different financial sources. So if I just give you one example, which was also emerging from those kind of international conference these days, is a JETP. It's a Just Energy Transition in Partnership, originally meant for South Africa, but maybe adopted by Indonesia and some of other Asian countries. What this JETP means is that we have to come together to support the country's transition towards net zero, because it needs a significant system transformation. It's not just that the public sector can do it, private sector has to join it. And we have to see that the policy and regulation, and those have to be also put in place. So this JETP type of blended finance is not just a typical project, it's more like a program to support that transition, in this case, energy transition towards the net zero. So it may be the multi-year project or the program and joined by the various the sources. And then in case of MDB, they have to really support the government to come up with a good transition strategy. And the commercial bank, the bilateral ODA fund also have to come together. Then that blended finance means that we can together reduce the cost of the capital, because that's one of the issues that why the current financial system is not fit for the purpose. So bringing us together, reduce the cost, bring the knowledge together, and promote the country's strategy of the transformation, the transition. That is something which the international community has been discussing these days, and it's going to be a very interesting model, maybe for China too, because you have already a very clear vision of, actually I would say before 2030, 60, the ecological civilization is a very good idea. It was before even Paris, or the SDGs, that this country has this very visionary thinking of ecological civilization, the circular economy, so that with those visions, the question is how we can really translate those great visions to a much more practice supported by finance. That's what we are facing. That's where I think we have a lot of work to do. Let me stop here.
Thank you, thank you. And that's a very vivid example of basically the highlighting the vision that the top-down approach that is very effective in the Chinese case. But we also want to hear from the bottom up as well. So I want to introduce Mr. Deng. Tell us about Huaneng's experience in green transition and addressing climate change as a leading electricity company. 请您分享一下华能在推进绿色低碳转型应对。
Okay, could you share with us what your company has been doing in driving down carbon emission? Well, China obviously is a vast country, and China Huaneng Group only accounts for around 10% of the total power output in the country. So in the past, for companies like China Huaneng, we need to realize that in terms of the total installed capacity, we rank at number 1. We are currently at 2.6 billion kilowatt with a total electricity output of 862 million kilowatt hour, which put us right at the top, not only in China but also globally. Starting from 2010 until 2020, we have realized leapfrog development in energy. In terms of installed capacity, we can rank number 1 in many sectors. For example, the newly added installed capacity for wind and solar PV is already over 100 million kilowatt. The total power generated is over 1 trillion kilowatt hour for wind and solar PV combined. We owe a lot to the government, commercial banks, and the private capital for their support.
because for the initial development, the policy was unstable because the consumption of the system has brought uncertainties to the returns of the investment. And with the lower down of the cost in terms of the installation and the production and the improvement of the efficiency, the NEV project can brought reasonable returns, and therefore commercial banks are able to make their investment in the NEV project. For example, for our group, about 80% of our investment being used in the green transformation, which was guided by China's President Xi Jinping's speech on constructing the power system based on the new energy. And we know that in China, we can see the air quality and the general environment has become better and better. And these are the benefits from our transformation in terms of our lifestyle and industrial production. So as the enterprise, our gratitude especially goes to the government, to the private sectors, and also for the investors, such as Primavera, to help us to transform from the high carbon consumption to low carbon, from low efficiency to high efficiency, and from fossil fuel to green energy, and finally to reach the double carbon goals in 2023 and 2030. And
a vivid example of, like you said, the combining the power from the government, from the private sector, and from the institutions to achieve the common goal. And then I want to invite Andrew to make a comment. And ING is part of the UN Net Zero Banking Alliance, a group of banks committed to aligning their lending and investment portfolios with net zero emission by 2050. That's a very ambitious goal. And as far as I learned today, over 130 trillion are committed globally to support the transition to zero carbon. So tell me, Andrew, how effective are the global financiers' efforts in this transition, and what else you want to do? How ambitious you are?
I think first off, the effectiveness of the financing community and the banking sectors is a function of adoption by our clients, because the execution happens through our clients. The important thing for the banking community, and in fact for any investment community, is that knowing that the decisions they make, how to use their capital, have an impact on the planet. And even more importantly, the decisions they make of how not to use their capital has a vital impact on the planet. Financing sits at the core of ensuring that all of that vision towards net zero is achieved. There are many elements that go into it, but financing is a key element amongst others. Technology, the regulatory hand played by the regulators, the government, the corporates, and the alliance is a body where we learn from each other. And ING, I don't know very many of you would know or not, but we've been in our own way in the leading edge of sustainable finance. ING was the first bank that did the sustainability-linked loan. It was actually, the term was coined by us, and we led that transaction, and many followed suit. We have goals, and I kind of want to bring it to life by sharing with you what are we doing. Otherwise, it just becomes, a little bit of the goals belonging to the other institutions who are part of the alliance. So we have an ambition, and you got to see it in the context of ING, which is contextualize it with its size. So we have an ambition that by 2025, for example, we will mobilize 120 billion per year in green financing. and sustainability financing. And we achieved over 100 billion last year. We're on to a similar journey this year. Knowing that our standards on sustainable financing are linked to the EU taxonomy. So there are many transactions that we're not able to participate in because it has to meet that standard. And actually, that has kept us in good shape because our clients now really prefer to have us as a part of their deal. And we actually work with a lot of other banks, learning from them and sharing with them. Because it's not about doing a transaction, it's about saving the planet. And we do a lot of conferences internally. A lot of board time in ING is spent internally to discuss this topic. And the way the slogan internally goes, sustainability at the heart. And we say it all the time internally. So how you preach yourself internally is how you act externally. And we have many other aspects where we said we would not do. For example, we stopped financing coal for many years now. We have recently, more than a year ago, said we will not finance new upstream dedicated oil and gas. These are dilemmas. There is transition at play. There is need for energy today. Renewable energy is not ready. But I think somebody has to make the move to take it forward. And I think there are many now who've joined the, and our victory is that everybody around us exceeds us. And that's what we want to achieve. We are, and the other thing that's really helping us is it just so happens that ING has always been led by industry expertise. That's how we are constructed on the inside. Every bank has a different model. Today, that is vital because only when you understand a certain sector will you be in a position to advise your client as to how they can reduce their carbon emissions. Because we work with many clients in the same space, and we can tangle with them. And our energy expertise, more than ever before, is coming handy, way beyond commercial benefits. And we hope to do better and better every day. We have, for example, led also the steel sector through the SSP, et cetera, et cetera. So I hope that gives you a bit of a color as to how that's playing out. And there are other banks doing similar things now. Everybody has goals, and the goals are getting expedited because every day we're watching the climate is moving against us faster than we have planned for. And therefore, we keep sharpening our pencil and we keep adding more objectives on what to do and what not to do with every passing year, quarter, almost every passing day.
Thank you. It's very important to identify what to do, but also, according to what you say, identify what not to do. And industry-wide organizations can hold each other accountable in delivering that. Like NACO says, bringing not just the capital, but also the capacity of various players. So come back to NACO again. You introduced to us briefly the blended finance and the effectiveness of that. But these transactions are difficult to replicate and to some extent has yet to reach a scale. What more can be done to bring that to a much larger scale?
Actually, can I just build on what ING and Lady mentioned? Because this is such an important issue about taxonomy, right? What does it really mean to us? I just came here this morning from 2 days conference in Malaysia. It's Energy Asia Conference, because as we all know, Asia still depends on so much of the fossil fuel. 70–80% of that energy comes from fossil fuel. So how we can really chart the pathway towards net zero. So as users, we cannot finish the move this overnight. We have to have a very credible pathway. At the same time, that pathway will be very different from region to region. The EU has its own pathway. Asia needs to have its own pathway. And when we think about this taxonomy, many of the Asian countries don't necessarily feel that we can just apply the EU type of taxonomy. We need a very credible pathway towards net zero. So what that Asian taxonomy may look like. So that I was very excited yesterday that the Malaysian Central Bank is talking about, they are now thinking about the Malaysian taxonomy for transition, meaning that how we can really demonstrate that our pathway, in this case Malaysia, that our pathway is credible to investors, not only just to ourselves, but to investors, so that still we can receive that a lot of international resources, so that they can deploy those resources toward and promote these transitional pathways. That this pathway, transition finance, is such a difficult concept. It cannot be used as an excuse not to accelerate, but it cannot also, it should be used to accelerate a real credible transition. So who is really certifying that the credibility of this pathway? And that is something that we commonly share, that's something that we really struggle every day. But then I think that unless we find out this region by region credible taxonomy to support pathway, promote the transitional pathway, we can't really do this on the net zero or the carbon neutral nature positive economy. So that's something I feel very strongly. And blended finance, again, this JETP I just mentioned, it's a just energy transition in partnership, meaning that there are two components, actually three components, how to accelerate, phase out of the coal, but how to accelerate the installation of the renewable energy. But one of the most important components is how to take care of just transition aspect, because there will be a lot of losers and winners. Then how we can take care of that population, this losing part, so that when this ETM, energy transition mechanism, was launched 2 years ago, Finance Minister of the Indonesia, Sri Mulyani, really made an extremely clear statement. We need a social contract with our own population, because it's a kind of big industrial, undertaking. So I think that blended finance is, in this case, it's not only one energy to another energy kind of transition, but it's also industrial transition with just the component. So that's the, in my view, beautiful concept of blended finance.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing that. And I mentioned at the beginning that transitional finance is one of the rare bright spots between the US-China relation last year at the Bali G20. Fred, you operate in China and in US a lot. I want to bring the very topical question to our discussion today. So between US and China, how climate finance can play a role?
Yeah, so as all of us have seen, our world, right, so divided, last few years with the rise in geopolitical tensions, particularly between US and China. So this is not helpful. In fact, it's counterproductive to our shared mission, which is to serve our planet, to really make the world a better place in terms of energy transition, net zero emission future. So, for humanity's sake, the two largest economy, US and China, got to work together, for shared mutual interest, but also for the externality, because the actions by US and by China have other repercussions on the world economy. And so I hope, despite all the differences between US and China, climate remains, one of the, biggest opportunities for the two countries to really find a way to engage with each other, to partner with each other, and lead the way, in the global mission. Just like we saw back in 2015, I think President Xi and President Obama really worked as partners, and their collaboration and the partnership was absolutely crucial, for the success of Paris climate agreement. So today, after Secretary Tony Blinken's visit to Beijing, and I hope Ambassador John Kerry, will come to Beijing very soon to resume the high-level climate talk between Washington and Beijing. So if we really focus on the common interest as opposed to excessively obsessed with the differences, then I think we can make a meaningful progress on fighting climate change. So that's my hope, and I'm actually quite encouraged by recent developments that the U.S. and China will be able to work together again, and then work with the many of our partners around the world, and most importantly, business sector and the financial sector, right? to speed up the energy transition and and really make tangible progress.
Thank you. Concrete actions from the business sector and from the financial sector can make a difference. I want to bring that from the macro to the micro level. Huaneng has successfully issued green bonds as the very first batch issuers in the exchange market in China. And Mr. Zheng, can you describe the current status of climate investment and financing Huaneng? You just mentioned 80% are all towards green and transitional financing. 请邓总给我们介绍一下华能气候投融资。
Okay, so please, could you introduce your outlook or your take on the future prospect of green transition? So for China, Huaneng, we on one hand relies on the public to facilitate the implementation of our projects, because we're currently exploring the pathway to safe, efficient, green and low carbon energy portfolio as we ensure energy security, which means we not only need to tap the existing assets to ensure energy security to the general public, but also find ways to transition from fossil fuels to green and clean energies. So we have several measures. First, we will vigorously develop renewables. If you look at our investment portfolio, over 80% goes into development of renewables. Each year, we will build and invest and operate and launch over 20 million kilowatt installed capacity of wind power. This year, we have already rolled out a sizable part of the program. These projects would not be possible without bank loans. So we appreciate the support of our partners and also the special funds we have established with our external partners. In the past, certain banks harbored certain reservations regarding such projects. For example, AIIB, the chairman, Jin Liqun, used to be doubtful about the prospect of our renewable projects, but now they are very proactive. So this is a very good progress, because many of the hesitant financial institutions have changed their attitude, and they are much more open and proactive in financing renewable energy projects. And we also have new technological advances. So I think the future bright for renewables is very bright. The second effort is to reform our existing energy portfolio. For such a large energy group, China Huaneng faces a process of transition, which may take up to 3 or 4 decades rather than 3 or 4 years. We need to set clear our priorities by establishing priorities and phasing out the outdated capacities in a gradual and incremental approach. That's why we are adopting a so-called coupled or dual-track approach to couple large installed capacity of renewables with long-distance transmission, with also to couple the end consumption with on-premise energy storage, and also to couple with investments in renewable energies with the phasing out of fossil fuels. So that's why in the beginning, you may see fossil fuels and renewables developing in tandem. But now we can already gradually increase the proportion of renewables to incrementally replace the content of fossil fuels in our energy portfolio and our power system. Also, we're adopting a lot of new technologies to address the intermittency of renewable energy forms to make it more stable, more reliable, and more predictable, which can greatly enhance users' experience. For the state, we also have the green policies to encourage adoption on the consumer's side. As the EU rolled out the renewable energy law, the rest of the world has been actively studying how we can follow the model of the EU. I expect to see more policies being released in China in terms of carbon pricing, carbon tax, and carbon trade regime, and also technology advancements. For example, the CCUS at China Huaneng, we are actively exploring the feasibility of such technologies. And also, how can we also combine power with heating to, on one hand, drive down its energy footprint, but also ensure energy security for the users. Yesterday, at the opening session, Premier Li Qiang noted that security is very important. Without security of power supply and green manufacturing, it is very hard to imagine a smooth green transition journey.
Very important point on combining the security and sustainability in the process, and given the magnitude of the problem, now Huaneng gives some very important example and practice in this direction. I want to turn to Andrew again. Angie led the charge mobilizing action in decarbonize the steel sector, among many other sectors, and the industry of significant importance in China. So what kind of lessons you learned in that transition at a global level that you think can give China some inspirations?
Actually, kind of similar to what was said in the context of renewable energy. So ING, as some of you may know, has led the body, which is SSP, Sustainable Steel, and in that context, Sustainable Steel Principles. So it's 5 banks, and in consultation with about 80 bodies, including NGOs, corporates, and other organizations. And the whole idea behind is to understand, appreciate, and facilitate progress of lesser emissions, and to make the steel sector converge with the net zero agenda. And no surprise, some of the key elements that stand in the midst of that challenge, which is a huge challenge. It's a complex sector. It's capital intensive to transition. You almost have to set up new facilities. And that leads to the various key blocks that have to be kind of injected to facilitate that. Carbon pricing is really important. The consumer is used to paying lesser pricing. And if you don't fix the user end and get them accustomed to the right pricing, as opposed to the competitive pricing, if I could call it, it is really difficult. So that is, and I won't say more about that because I think some really vital comments were made here. Amidst other aspects of it is, of course, technology, which is evolving and will continue to evolve. But you have to play with what you have and what you figured out. And different sectors are intertwined, and energy is one sector that anchors almost every sector. So you pretty much have to fix renewable energy to fix the steel sector. And I think some of these elements are key the regulators have a really important hand to play. The governments have a big hand to play. And I think what we have to do is propel the right behaviors and the right expectations from the consumer. It's a choice between whether where we live today will be it's not a habitat that we can live in, or we're going to resist paying the right pricing for basic commodities that today are artificially very low priced, which the planet cannot afford. So those are the core fundamentals. The work continues, and we are working with our clients to make sure it ties into our goals to achieve an intermediate target by 2030 to reduce emissions by 45% relative to 2010, and of course by 2050 to net zero in every sector, steel being one of them.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing the experience and also bringing to the conversation a very important stakeholder, the consumers. That is a very important part of the discussion. I promise I will open up the floor for taking questions from the audience because many of you are experts in this field, but I want to start by my own question to stir the pot a little bit. We talk about the transition finance a lot, and there are also worries about greenwashing, and in this case, transition washing. How to ensure the accountability when we plan to hand out more transitional finance and encourage transitional finance. Anyone want to take first? Fred?
Okay.
Or Andrew?
I'll go with it. Well, I mean, greenwashing, we all have read a lot about it in recent press, and I think several members of the industry, as well as several members of the financing community have had some takeaways in that regard. I think the simple headlines on that are we just simply have to be honest about the real impact of what we say versus what the impact truly is. And I think living with the right standards which actually lead to an improvement in carbon emissions is the only way to go, which has been well recognized. So there is a lot at play now. I think we're in a very different place. And for example, I will just share with you, not more than 2 years ago, there is a lot of transactions and deals that we would pitch for, and we would lose them because our standards and the KPIs to transition would be outdone by competition, if I could call it that. Today, we see that a lot of our corporate clients, they are actually more conservative than the banks because they don't want to see a headline that impairs their branding. So we actually have to convince them sometimes that these KPIs will help you and they are the right transition path. So I think greenwashing is shown, there's a marked movement away from it, and which goes with basically transition hand in hand. It's a promise to transition. The promise just has to be real.
Thank you. Naka, you have anything to add?
No, as you said, I mean, the challenge is that who is really certifying the credibility of this transition pathway? It's easy to say as of today, if it is white, if it is black. But if you really see, as you mentioned, that this transition takes 3-4 decades, then how can we be sure this plan, transition pathway, is credible enough and enough for investors to put money? And then that requires a really coordinated effort from top to bottom, from the policy to business. But also, we need to find a way for the international community to really come together to certify or to give the credibility of those transition pathways. Yep. Otherwise, we would be in limbo. Particularly, the countries who do not have access to the capital market. Then even if not low-income countries, many of the middle-income countries do not have enough access to capital market. So how we can really provide those credibility? That's something we need to really come together to find a mechanism to.
Yes,
Yeah.
credibility is the key. And with that, I'll open up to the floor and take questions. And you're in the middle. Can we have a mic? Front row. Can you bring the mic to the front row? Here, in front row.
Thank you. I'm a journalist from Taishan Media. I have a question about the financial instruments. We know the risk of climate change infrastructure is often too long-term for some conventional investors to accurately calculate, and for climate change mitigation projects, risk can be too high for the short term. And the project developers and technologists can lack the demonstration of the track record required to do risk or to consider it by the conventional investors. So I'd like to ask what kind of new sets of financial instruments and the structures we need to overcome this limitation. Thank you.
And your question is directed to?
Who?
Fred, please.
Yeah, so thank you. I think some points already come out from the panel discussion. Sustainable finance, to be sustainable, you need a decent return, right, to compensate for all the risks. I think what the government can do, regulator can do, is really to foster transparent regulatory policy regime to reduce uncertainty, particularly for long-term investment, like what Mr. Deng says, some take like 3 decades or even longer, right, to bear fruits for those projects. So there's a lot of uncertainty. So if the regulation changes or tax code change, make it even more untenable. So I think that the government should make sure to minimize that kind of uncertainty to provide the predictable environment. For financial institutions, depending on if it's a loan or credit, I'm sure institutions like ING, they have a lot of experience, expertise to underwrite, that kind of whether it's lending or policies. And capital markets, is another, right? So all kind of existing financial instruments, I believe many of them actually can be used successfully for climate financing. For private equity and venture firm, so they are looking for innovative technologies, right? Like they are distinct, differentiated from traditional, say, fossil energy, power plants like coal-fired plants versus like wind or solar, farm, or traditional combustion engine versus EV. Right? And then energy storage, like a next generation batteries. So, they're looking for this kind of truly innovative technologies, but also founders, with the vision and focus on climate, and then they are addressing larger TAM, addressable markets, right? So with the commercialization prospects, so to get the return. So I would say generally private sector is very innovative. If we are whether it's here in China or elsewhere, if banks provide this capital are incentivized to participate, they will be very also creative to find the various ways depending on the situation to come up with innovative financing solutions. Okay, so what I need is just government to provide a more favorable, transparent framework.
Thank you, Fred. Any other questions from the floor? Use the opportunity. The lady in the middle.
Hi, my name is Charlie. I'm a founder and CEO of Urban Metri. We're a city data company based in Malaysia, actually. So welcome to Malaysia. My question actually is directed to Ms. Abrol. Just now you mentioned a little bit about mispricing of some of our commodities and what we're consuming. I wanted to hear your thoughts about valuation of assets and whether are we misvaluing a lot of our traditional assets that allows or falsely motivates some of our financiers in terms of opportunity costs and what they are directing their capitals to. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for the question. That's what climate risk management is all about, because several of the assets, if they are not sustainable, very soon will not be bankable. For example, if I had a coal asset on my books today, I can't find a buyer for that asset. And so I have to provide the right level of capital for the type of asset that we hold. In fact, at ING, for example, we have just recently, this year, started the practice of evaluating climate risk on literally every file and every credit, and actually assessing it and ranking it. Because we have to acknowledge that during the term of that asset on our books, that asset could get outdone by sustainable assets. And that is, for example, a lever that requires us to stay clear of assets that will not be tenable during the tenor. And it also propels the right behavior by the industry and by our clients to work with us towards a transition pathway, which coincides with our transition pathways for each of the 9 sectors that we have climate transition pathways internally set up. So that's the way sort of we deal with it. And it's an outcome of various knowledge exchanges with the industry, importantly with other banks, and many other institutions are working in different ways to make progress in that way.
Yes, please, Nicole.
Yeah, I just also want to jump in here. There is another asset which is not really well priced. It's natural capital or nature. Then we are not really appreciating the true value of natural capital. And that's one of the reasons we continue to degrade the nature base. So that so while we try to put the right price on the carbon, I think that we also need to find out how to appreciate the true value of natural capital. And currently, the TCFD, TNFD, ISSB, those efforts only see the nature from more risk side, that how much risk that we incur if we destroy nature. But I really want to see more about how to put the positive value or the value of that natural capital to the economy. And by doing that, I think that we will find a way, much better way to realize a nature positive economy. So carbon neutral is one thing, but then there is also the agreement, and actually under the Chinese presidency at the COP15, that the nature positive or global goal for nature. And here the pricing, the measurement of that true value of the nature becomes such an important thing. And again, that China has such a wonderful example where they spearhead of this agenda by doing a growth ecosystem product, GEP, so that now people are talking about the GDP, beyond the GDP, but you have been already doing this GEP far ahead of the globe, that find out it's important. So I really want your country, China, to really share that kind of practice, even if it's not complete and not systematic yet, but to provide that kind of instrument to the world so that the world can also learn how to do this natural capital valuation in a much more systemic way.
Thank you, Nako, for that. Any other questions from the audience? And we have a few minutes. Oh, the gentleman on the corner.
Thank you very much. Really an excellent panel. I wanted to ask, building on on climate risk disclosure, and we're seeing now a whole bunch of different mandatory standards that within national jurisdictions as well as international standards through IFRS. How do you see these, and how important are these both in the greenwashing and in putting some accountability around green transition. Thank you.
And the question is for?
The question is for everyone up there, because you're also
Any
inspiring. Yeah, thank you.
Who would want to take this?
I just want to confirm that I get your question appropriately. You're talking about the standards being imposed being sort of impractical and challenging, or it came a bit.
No, it was just that I wasn't commenting on whether they're practical or not. It's just if there are, how important are those in complying with the standards for climate risk disclosure? US SEC, the European Union SFTR, the IFRS ISSB. Are those important from your perspective in terms of both obviously in complying with those standards, but also in accelerating green transition?
Okay, maybe I'll take a first stab at sharing my perspective, and anybody else can join. In the absence of more data, more concrete correlation between the pathway to transition and the impact on climate, which is constantly getting fine-tuned and getting more accurate, I think what we have on hand is worth complying with and leads us in the right direction. And I think somebody on the panel said that, perhaps it was our moderator who said that let not the best standards available today be an excuse to do nothing.
Yeah.
So I would take what we have, roll with it, and build the plane as we fly it.
That is really fundamental, I think, as Angie just said, that because we need a standardized way of measurement, and that is a kind of fundamental platform to go for that. Without that, we can't even compare that my value chain resilient enough or that sustainable enough and for the outside, actually, the investors. So to have this standardized way of measurement is such a fundamental way to really chart the pathway for the transition, the sustainability by a company base, but also from financial sector point of view, so that we really want to continue to work on that. And my hope is that we will do it not only the carbon, but also the global, actually the broader natural capital, so that I hope that after TCFD, that I want to see also the good work for the TNFD. And we all know TNFD work, it's nature, that disclosure, that is much more challenging. But as you just said, that we can't make that how do you say, the perfect good or enemy of the good, the other way around.
Yes.
Anyway, so that we have to really start with that without that we are losing the time and we are losing the nature. It's such an astonishing speed, so that we have to really start doing that.
我想就刚才这位先生的问题啊。
Okay, to follow with this question from the gentleman, I would like to comment on two aspects. First of all, we need to be clear that with the increase of CO2 emission, the extreme weather has been increasing, and our climate has become hotter. And our natural disaster has increased, and the threat to human being also increased. And I would really like to emphasize that with our forum, with our media, we need to send out the information, the impact brought by the climate change. And everybody in your daily life, in your work, you are closely related to the CO2 emission. And producing a kilowatt of electricity has different cost with producing a kilowatt of green electricity. For example, if Huaneng produce all the electricity to the WEF, we can reduce 800 tons of carbon, but it comes with a price. So where does the price come from? It's from our production. But this is not to the knowledge of the users, of the public. And therefore, we need to send out the information that for every kilowatt of green electricity, the cost is 700, the emission is 700 kilogram. And for every kilowatt of green, the carbon emission is about 1 graph. So we do encourage you to use the green power. And if you generate 1 kilowatt with natural gas, the carbon emission is about 400 grams. And if the whole society choose to consume green electricity, and the production of the electricity and the business environment and the financial support will become more supportable for the human demand.
So I think the media has the role to play.
Important point to the discussion. Before we wrap up, we're running out of time. As a tradition of Caixin debate at the World Economic Forum, I want everyone to finish with one keyword for our audience to take away. If you use one keyword to describe the most important thing we have to get right for climate financing, what would that be? I'll start with Nako.
Well, I'm not prepared for that. Well, I just want to echo what Mr. Deng said, that every one of us is a change agent. We have to take it, it's our own issue and our own future.
Yeah.
So that it's not somebody's issue, it's not another finance sector issue, it is really our issue.
Yeah.
That's the most important thing, I think.
Accountability on everyone, yes. And Deng Zong.
我想说一
Okay, the keyword is common cooperation. Climate change is not a challenge that can be tackled by any individual, nation, company, or person. It requires collective endeavor of the entire global community.
And Joe, please.
Urgency.
Urgency. That's strong enough. And Fred, the last word.
Innovation, collaboration.
Innovation and
Collaboration.
collaboration. Thank you very much. Please join me in thanking our panelists for this wonderful session.